Hey people, how's it going? Welcome back to the Pai Huaita YouTube channel. Today we're going to be continuing our Primer in Space series, talking about Russia in space and how they are kind of in a little bit of a cold legacy. Again, the purpose of this video is to just give a quick overview of what's going on with Russia in space, nothing too in depth, because eventually I want to focus on the anthropology of space. What does it mean to be a Russian, and thinking about and dealing with space on a day-to-day basis. But before we get there, we have to just generally know what in all the world is happening with Russia in space. Okay, to that end, we're going to be talking about the Russian Space Forces, Roscosmos, and Russian space launch facilities. Okay, starting with the Kosmicheski Vojska России, the Russian Space Forces. Of course, I like to start with a quote, and I think it's a great place to start with Yuri Gagarin, the first man to ever go to space. He said that he wanted to dedicate this first space flight to the people of communism, to the Soviet people, and to all men on Earth that are about to enter communism. Now, that didn't happen, but it's important for us at least to have this in our minds that Russia inherited the Soviet space enterprise. All things space that Russia has is because of the Soviet Union. So to that end, talking about the space forces, even the organization of the space forces is a legacy of the Soviet system. The Soviets were clumpers. They like to clump things together. So all the things that do aerospace, all of those are together. So the space forces, being aerospace, are clumped in with the Air Force and the Air and Missile Defense Forces. To nerd out for 2 seconds, this is different than, say, how the Americans or how the Chinese would do it. We're splitters, right? Like, we had an Air Force that did space things here in the United States, and we're like, nah, the space is different than air, so split that off and make a whole Space Force. Russia's the opposite. They're like, well, space is kind of part of aerospace, so that's all going to be one thing. Now, the Russian Space Forces have a little bit of a history of dissolving and then reforming just a couple times since the Russian Federation became an independent country from the Soviet Union. But the reason I mentioned it's a cold legacy is because they only conducted 17 launches in 2025. If we think back to the last video, we'll note that China and the People's Liberation Army Aerospace Force conducted 93 launches in 2025. So Russia only conducting 17 is substantially lower. So all that to say, they're lagging behind the United States and China in terms of their launch activity. Okay, moving on from the Space Forces, we'll talk about Roscosmos. Roscosmos is in a little bit of a dire strait right now. Again, just part of this cold legacy that Russia is seeing with their space enterprise. Only 9 launches since the start of the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine. So all the way from end of February 2022 till now it's August of 2026, only 9 launches. So not looking great. In part, this is because there has been a suspended cooperation with the European Space Agency, and Roscosmos got so upset with NASA in 2022, they're like, all right, we're going to stop working with NASA. And then they realized, hey, you know what? NASA's actually paying us for 71 return trips from the ISS on our Soyuz capsules, which is about, a cool $4 billion. So Roscosmos was like, oh, okay, fine, we'll keep playing with NASA. All that to say, though, the big impact here is that Roscosmos has lost 90% of its launch service contracts since the war began in Ukraine. I think the reasons for this are fairly obvious, but we'll walk the dog on this for 2 seconds. It is tough geopolitically for countries to want to cooperate with Roscosmos since they are not just like Russian, but they are supporting what's going on in Ukraine. Again, the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russian military forces. To that end, they've actually recruited for a campaign called the Uran Battalion, the Uranus Battalion, which is a militia unit in the war in Ukraine. This is kind of crazy. Here's the website for the Uran Battalion, and we'll just go here and the pictures kind of speak for themselves. You got dudes with military gear, like sniper rifles and drones and tank, which, like, no guesses for what tank means there in the bottom right. It means tank. Yeah. It's just hard to imagine NASA or the Chinese National Space Administration doing anything close to this. And even on like the left, the bottom left, you'll see three cosmonauts, which is the Russian version of astronauts, holding up the flag of the Luhansk People's Republic, which is not an internationally recognized place. They didn't even have the courtesy to like iron out the crinkles in the flag. So, anyways, all that to say, Roscosmos having lost so much of their launch or like capacity and capability because no one wants to work with them, and it's not, launching things to space tends to be expensive, and it's better to do that if someone else is paying for it, or at least in part. They've now resorted to things like the Uran battalion. So, desperate times call for desperate measures. Okay, talking now about Russian space launch centers. There are four main ones that we're going to talk about. There actually is kind of a fifth one. It's way out in the east of Russia called Svobodny, but that was ended up really kind of being canceled because of Vostochny exists. But we'll talk about that in a sec. Okay, the first place we're going to talk about is Cosmodrome Baikonur. Constructed in 1955 in Kazakhstan, it's notable for a whole bunch of historic launches. So Sputnik, with the first satellite to go into orbit, Yuri Gagarin, the first human to go into orbit, and then the Soyuz missions. But again, hey, this place is located in Kazakhstan. This is because in 1955, Kazakhstan was part of the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union went away, Russia was like, well, we kind of still need that. So they lease Baikonur from the Kazakhstani government. Baikonur is Kazakh for wealthy brown, as in fertile soil. And I do think that, for all of the ragging I've done on some parts of the Russian space enterprise, certainly Baikonur has been fertile soil for space development worldwide. Okay. Next is Cosmodrome Plesetsk, or the Plesetsk Cosmodrome. And can I stop for 2 seconds? Cosmodrome, cool name. I love Cosmodrome. That's such a cool word. Like, we have Space Launch Center. Like, that's cool and all, but Cosmodrome, that rocks. Anyway, so this Plesetsk Cosmodrome is located in northern Russia, constructed in 1957 originally as an ICBM site, or an intercontinental ballistic missile site. Now, if you don't know too much about ICBMs, that's perfectly fine. Basically, they're these missiles that go up into space and then back down and hit wherever they're trying to target. Now, it is interesting, ICBM site, and now it's kind of like a space launch center. That's because, there's a surprising amount of overlap between ICBMs and space launch vehicles, or rockets that go into space. So this site mainly launches military satellites, and it's a primary location for launching into polar orbits. So those orbits are kind of going like north to south, at least on like a map type orbit. So around the Earth, from the Arctic down to Antarctica and back. This is especially useful for the Russians as, again, this site is fairly far north. It's named after the word Plyos, which is an older word that means river reach. So great for Plesetsk. Okay, the next place is Vostochny Cosmodrome. This is their newest cosmodrome. It's located way out in eastern Russia, and if you speak Russian, that's not a surprise for you because Vostochny means eastern. This is Cosmodrome Vostochny, or the Eastern Cosmodrome. Great. This is the primary launch site for civil satellites, so looking at things like GLONASS, their version of GPS, SATCOM, and human spaceflight, all coming out of Vostochny. And I mentioned earlier there was another Cosmodrome, Svobodny Cosmodrome, that ended up being canceled in favor of Vostochny, so good to know there. Okay, the last place I'm going to talk about is Kaspustin Yar. It literally means Cabbage Valley, which is kind of a fun, it's a fun name, especially because this place kind of has the same aura, the same vibe in the Russian conception as Area 51. So imagine if we called Area 51, I don't know, apple or orchid or orchard, apple orchard, right? As opposed to Area 51. That's kind of the same thing. So they have Kasputyn Yar, we have Area 51. But all that to say, this is a highly secretive launch site, so it's actually kind of hard to find pictures of it online. But you can see the image there. They're launching an Iskander-M, which is a type of missile. So all that to say, just another place that's highly secretive, and it does military things for the Russians. Okay, And with that, we have talked about just a brief primer, brief overview of what's going on in Russia with their space. We talked about the space forces. We talked about Roscosmos and then their space launch centers, or in Russian, their cosmodromes. So with that, thank you very much for watching. I hope this primer has been good just to give you a quick little overview. And again, there will be more videos in the future talking about the anthropology of what does it mean to be a Russian and to care about space. But until then, I hope all is well with you. Take care and bye-bye.